So thank you very much for coming, everyone. I'm Professor Daniel Chua. I'm a professor of music, but I'm also a director of faith and global engagement. So thank you so much for coming to another one of our distinguished lectures, which is very well funded by the MacDonald Foundation. Now, nature matters. Or does it really matter? Actually, we know nature matters, right? But we don't seem to act as if nature really matters. And the thing is because quite often, it's what I guess Al Gore used to say from his famous documentary. It's an inconvenient truth, right? It's really inconvenient. Who wants to be inconvenienced by the truth? I mean, if it was a really convenient truth, this whole lecture theatre would be full, right? But when you come to something like this, it's so inconvenient. So first of all, I want to thank you for coming, because I know it may be an inconvenient truth for all of you today. But of course, Al Gore's documentary that was done, I think, about 20 years ago now, and it sort of stirred up some interest about climate change, but sort of that's died away. But at that same time, about 20 years ago, there was another term that was just emerging that has become a word that has sort of become a kind of conscience for climate change, and that word is the Anthropocene. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Anthropocene. So the anthropo is just the bit that means human, and the scene is the new age. So this is the new geological age, and the idea is that now humans have made their mark on this rocky planet, and we are now part of a new geological age, the Anthropocene. And the geologists even set up a kind of working group to figure out whether this was true, and just fairly recently they decided that it wasn't true. They did not want to have the Anthropocene. They thought it was a bad idea. But of course, geologists are interested in rocks, right? They just are hard, stony kind of people. The idea that, that humans are important is not important to them, because humans are just a blip in that sort of huge geological timescale that they work on. But for us, I'm in the humanities, and also in the social sciences, the term Anthropocene, well, it has our name on it, right? The human element is there. We've never been, written in a geological age. So we're very excited about the Anthropocene, and we've been worked up about it for many years now. And it's really a name that speaks of an existential crisis for humanity. Basically, we think of it as a kind of tombstone, a geological tombstone for our species. It's as if we have written our own epitaph. Nature matters, we didn't care, we are now extinct. That's basically what it says on the Anthropocene tombstone. But if you think about it, that existential threat, that fear of our own species becoming extinct, right? Even that has not been a very powerful motivator for us to really care about nature. So the question today that we're asking is this: is there another way of thinking about our motivations, about caring about nature? Does religion play a role? Does belief play a role? Does faith play a role? Does belief count for tree frogs? All right, that's the concept of it. Does religion have anything to say? And is it in any way a better way of thinking about this? And can it be a better motivator in terms of caring about nature? And to explore this question with us, our speaker today is Peter Harris. And Peter is a co-founder of the Christian conservation organization called A Rocha, which has bases over 20 countries in the world, covering 5 continents, and have been doing an amazing work for over 40 years now, I believe. And now Peter is also a person that not only cares about nature, he likes to inhabit nature, and I know that this morning he was already watching birds early in the morning in the rain. And in fact, I think You've banded, 50,000 species of bird in your life? No, birds. 50,000, not species, but 50,000 birds. That's a lot. That's very cool. So Peter is definitely a man of nature. So please join me in welcoming a man of nature and also a force of nature in the conservation world, Peter Harris.
Thank you very much. You know you're being introduced by a musicologist when there are only 12,000 species of birds in the world. And, anyway, I won't talk about the Vaughan Williams that we were listening to as we came in, but I'll stay off the music and you stay off the birds, and then we're all going to be happy. But and actually, somebody was the first man on the planet to see 10,000 species of birds. And I would swap my 50,000 in the hand for his 10,000 that he saw any day. Very much so. But anyway, thank you very much for the welcome. And thank you for listening. And it is interesting that although each one of you is precious and everybody should be here, there are many, many empty seats for really what my wife and I decided 50 years ago was going to be the issue of our times and the issue we wanted to give our lives to. And at the time, I was actually working as an Anglican minister near Liverpool, famed for its football, but if you say which team you support in Liverpool, you are likely to get death threats from 50% of the others, so I won't go there. But at that time, we knew this was going to be the issue of our times, and it still is, and actually things have become even more clear. And yet we are sparsely inhabiting this lecture theatre. And I want to suggest right from the start that this is probably because there hasn't been a good argument for why nature matters, and I want to explore that with you now. So, oversimplifying a little bit, there have been two essential arguments around in my shop, which is, if you like, the people who care about nature, for why we should care about nature. And this is the first one. It's essentially a rerun of utilitarian thinking. And if you read the subtext in what's here, biodiversity is vital and priceless. It's much more than the pleasant picture it is to look at. So that's writing out the aesthetic argument for nature straight off. Without biodiversity, both human and animal life would be completely incapable of surviving. So essentially, boiling it down, we will not survive without nature. And then you notice that having said about animal life, it pivots automatically to we rely on nature. My daughter runs comms for an organization. And she was saying the other day that when there's an organizational photo of all the people there, she zooms in on how she looks in the photograph. And if she looks good, it doesn't matter if everybody else looks weird, that's the photo she's going to publish. And she was saying it's a little bit like us. We are the thing in the picture that we care about. He gave a bit of a nod towards animal species, but quickly we're into me. And we have to recognize that Western culture, which has become this global export, has been essentially me-focused for a very long time, probably 500 years. It's me, it's my story, it's what's in it for me. And the modern manifestations of that in consumerism and hypercapitalism are just extensions of that. And the Romantic movement, going back to your music, is just an artistic expression of that. Me and my feelings. And now what we have with regard to truth is me and my truth, me and my reality. And it's really difficult to make an argument for nature out of what I need for a number of different reasons. But it's essentially saying that we are the ones who have to have nature. Let's just review some of the problems in that. One of the problems is we don't actually know which bits of nature we need. We are only just at the beginning of discovering, if you like, nature. One tends to think, we at one point mounted an expedition or several expeditions in Papua New Guinea, and we discovered 200 completely new species that nobody knew about. And I thought this was going to be amazing and people would be scrambling over themselves to name them and describe them. And then I discovered there are rather few taxonomists in the world, people who describe new things, and they're completely overwhelmed. That even the most basic things we have not described, we don't know about, we don't know what they do, which is why you can argue from a utilitarian point of view that to get rid of all of these things is like burning a library without reading the books. We know that 70% or so of, there's somebody medically interested here this evening, you'll get the percentages right, but it's maybe 70% of the drugs that we use for health are in some sense plant-derived. We know that plants play an enormous role in human health, and yet we're just letting them go extinct. without knowing what they do, and certainly not without knowing how they're interacting with each other in the environment. So you can make utilitarian arguments for nature and say, we need it to keep us well, we need it for our psychological health. People in COVID discovered, didn't they, how being locked down was just terrible for mental health, and they needed space. And I've heard here in Hong Kong that the trails have been completely differently occupied since COVID because people discovered them during that time. So we do know we need nature, but we don't know which bits of nature we need, and particularly we don't know when it comes to financing it. I am an inveterate fundraiser for nature, and I can tell you it's difficult to raise funds for warm, furry animals that look appealingly at your donor, but you try raising it for things that are critical in the ecosystem like algae or fungi or bacteria, and it's really difficult. People are not motivated. The amphibians are a bit of a Cinderella in the fundraising world, and yet over half the world's amphibians are threatened with extinction, I gather. And we've lost some in recent years, forever. So the practicalities of directing resources to the bits of nature that we need are extremely difficult, even if it was a good moral argument. And this dilemma about how we're failing to make a good argument for nature has not gone unnoticed. Here's an op-ed from the New York Times from a while ago. Food, humanity, habitat, and how we get to 2050. We struggle to find reasons why other species and ecosystems are important, searching mostly for utilitarian arguments, their value as medicines, for instance, that specify their usefulness to us. And then the writer says, my own answer is less utilitarian. They have a value of their own existence. I adhere to a conclusion reached long ago by James Madison in 1818, who said simply that it cannot be right for all of Earth's resources to be made subservient to the use of man. We need to act on that principle. Now here he's introduced right and wrong out of thin air, apparently. But this is tending towards another argument for nature, which is not just that we need it, but you could call it the intrinsic value argument. And in fact, a group of people have cohered around this to the extent of calling themselves the intrinsics. And this is a commentary that Robert Nelson made a while ago for environmentalists, and that's a broad term, isn't it? Nature has what they call intrinsic value. That is, it's outside of human benefit. In other words, it doesn't matter whether it's useful to us or not. We just have to simply say, it matters, and that's the end of the story. We don't have to establish human benefits in order to value or protect or want to do good things for nature. The word creation is used throughout environmental discussions as a place where we can go to learn. Now, environmentalists don't always say God, but what they really mean is to learn about the mind of God as it was manifested in the creation. And here we're going to an edge of environmental argument, which is essentially mystical. And friends of mine who would not call themselves any kind of believer have quite frequently said to me that when they go into a forest, or if they're lucky enough to swim with a whale shark, or they have a deep immersion, as it were, in nature, there's just this sense of, and then they struggle for language, but they might say the spiritual or the sacred. And several have actually asked me, what's going on? Why do I feel that? I've really got no sense of formal religious belief, and yet nature is somehow telling me of its importance beyond myself. And so this is another kind of argument for nature, but it is extremely difficult to establish it as a force against other things which are equally good. So talking from my perspective, I might want to say this wetland is tremendously important. If you're there at dawn and you see the migrating birds lifting out of the reed beds and heading northwards into the blazing sunrise, something in me is huge. And then another person might say, well, jobs are beautiful as well. We need the wetland because it's cheap land. We're going to build all over it. That's also beautiful. and those are my values. And you're stuck in an argument of values which are not rooted in any kind of belief. And it's a deep problem for those who want to insist on the intrinsic value of nature, appealing to values but no beliefs behind them. And Daniel, in a way, mentioned this. We act as though nature didn't matter. I'm just looking at the money now, where in Hong Kong, a famed commercial and financial centre where money is a frequent topic of conversation and is occupying many people's lives. And yet, if you follow the money, we clearly don't think nature does matter. And this United Nations Environment Programme report estimating that in 2022, $1.7 trillion of public money was directed towards economic activities that were harmful to nature, which is 10 times greater than public investment in any kind of what they now call nature-based solutions. In other words, solutions for economic growth that are going to favour nature. And that's when it comes to public money. And in the private money story, it's well different. Private investment with direct negative impact on nature in 2022 amounted to roughly $5 trillion, 140 times greater than private investment in nature-based solutions. And this is years after the emergence of ESG, or environmental social governance considerations for business. So just follow the money, like was famously said in the Watergate film, All the King's Men. Just follow the money. It'll tell you the truth about what we really care about. Our money tends to do that. I'm fortunate enough to be friends with both these gentlemen. Claudio Campagna, who studied sea lions in Patagonia for 25 years, I think either before becoming a medical doctor or afterwards, and then turned himself into a philosopher of language and is a Wittgenstein expert, and Daniel Guevara. And this was out of a seminar that we did, looking at the very problems of language that we've got when we talk about nature, that we don't have a way to express what's happening around us. Terms like ecocide have been looked at, the Anthropocene has been looked at. Part of their thesis was when soldiers began treating the prisoners of the enemy with Florence Nightingale and people, it was because a language of compassion emerged, and they had a language for that. We are not treating nature compassionately, and it's maybe because we just don't have a compelling story, we don't have compelling language. I can tell you, as somebody who does get up early, and even 2 weeks ago was in forest being bitten by leeches and all kinds of things in order to be there, that people like me are not going to do that to improve GDP. We're not going to say, there's an economic benefit in nature for human life, and that's why I'm going to do it. Conservationists typically are people who make huge sacrifices. I have friends who've spent 6 months of every year in the jungle, separated from their wives and their families, to learn the things they're learning. And it doesn't come without sacrifice, and you're not going to do it for financial reasons. You're just not. And so Claudio and Daniel have said there is at present no unifying moral perspective for conservation practitioners. We're doing this great stuff and we have no idea why. Not in a coherent way. So have you followed me so far? I'm suggesting to you that among the predominant arguments for why nature matters, we have two that cannot be synthesized. One that says nature matters because we need it, and in a limited financial environment, because the money going into nature is tiny compared to that which is looking after culture and health. I mean, minimal, let alone international money. So if you're going to put those very limited resources and say we're only going to protect the things which will benefit us, you don't even know. And not least because of the emerging discipline of network ecology, which says it's not just about describing the elements, it's about describing how they're all interacting with each other. And we need AI, because these relations, you have 2,000 species in an ecosystem, they're all reacting with each other and interreacting, and that will tell you the health of the ecosystem. Well, how on earth do you know which bit to put your money into protecting? This fungus, that frog, This bird of prey because it's spectacular. Oh, that animal because it's cuddly and furry and it'll look at my donors. It might be completely irrelevant to the healthy ecosystem. Let it go. So that's the problem with that theory. And then you've got the other theory that says nature is just wonderful. It's beautiful. It deserves to have its own life. We've got to do something about it. But I can't tell you why. And for policymakers and politicians and finance people, if you say, I can't tell you why, let me tell you, they'll show you where the door is immediately. Of course they will. If you can't tell them why it matters, why would they put 1 cent towards doing anything about it? You have no idea why you're doing it. That is not the logic of the markets. Just to spell out where this has left us and why the fact that the modern environmental movement could be said to start with Rachel Carson and Silent Spring and that study of pesticides and all the rest of it, almost my lifetime really. During my lifetime, the global biomass of wild mammals has fallen by 82%, pretty much since, 50 years ago. That's just if you weighed the wild animals on Earth. They weigh 82% less now in that blink of geological time, which is why the geologists aren't interested. I once took a geologist with me to fundraise for a project to save some coastal habitat in Portugal. And the donors were there, and they asked my geologist friend for his advice, and he said, in 50,000 years, this is going to be critically difficult. And I could see them thinking, yeah, well, I probably don't need to fund you then. Anyway, never get a geologist involved. But this is warp speed in biological time. 72% of the indicators developed by indigenous peoples and local communities show ongoing deterioration of elements of nature important to them. If I'd have been prepared to risk going high-tech and showing you video clips and bells and whistles, which I've sworn never to do since a lecture theatre was plunged in darkness with 2,000 riotous American students for at least 2 minutes when they promised me they'd show the film. Anyway, I've never shown films ever again. But I go around the world collecting on my phone little clips of people talking from indigenous communities about what they knew when they were kids. And they tell me the weather is chaotic. We used to go into the forest and we could go half a mile and we were already hunting and now there's nothing there. Just 2 weeks ago in Sarawak, I heard this from the Kalabit people. Only 1,000 of whom are still living in their community because there's no hunting and everybody's gone to the cities. There's only 7,000 speaking that language in the world and only 1,000 of them left in their tribal land. If you map, actually, it's by as this is multidisciplinary, if you map where languages are going extinct and biodiversity are going extinct, it's pretty much the same map. It's very interesting and very sad. But essentially, the people there were saying all of these things. They said there used to be eagles all over our valley. There used to be birds from every tree. When we moved to Portugal, and this was in 1983, to begin studying the migration of birds there and to do something about the fact that 18 million birds a year were being shot on migration in Portugal, the old shepherds used to say to me, once I'd learned Portuguese, by the way, and I thought, when I learn Portuguese, it's going to be so wonderful. I'll understand what everybody's saying. And then I went, when I did, and sat down on the beach with the fishermen, and they were basically talking about British football and how they were really bored with their wives cooking. And that was it. It was kind of, oh, mate, So anyway, you did. Where was I? Where was I at? Migration of birds. The shepherds, thank you. This is probably my last ever gig, by the way. I have these blanks. The shepherds said to me, oh, you should have come 50 years ago. The birds were dripping off every branch. There were 12 golden orioles in every tree, not just 2 in a season. You've missed it. And now, compared to what we were seeing in the early 80s, it's really, really quiet. Extraordinarily quiet. And it's happened really very quickly. And people are aware of it. And so it's not just about species, it's about ecosystem. They've declined by 47% on average. 25% of species are already threatened with extinction in most of the animal and plant groups we've studied. And biotic integrity, that's the abundance of naturally present species, has declined by 23% on average in terrestrial communities. And the marine situation, incidentally, is far more drastic. So this is where we've got to, if you like, with a contemporary environmental movement that is now something like 60 years old, and everything is going in the wrong direction, and acceleratingly so. If you look at the graphs, they're all hockey sticks. You may feel this is getting very depressing, but don't worry, we're going to do a bit of a pull around in a minute, because I do have a suggestion to you as to how something about this may change. But this is just to show you where we are with the current global extinction risk in all the different species groups, and looking at how high they are. Who knew cycads, which are this wonderful plant, would be really so much at risk? But it's all kinds of things. And even I come from a country that's supposed to be wild about nature. In the United Kingdom, we have over 1 million members for the Royal Society of the Protection of Birds, more than all the political parties put together. And even in the UK, in just the last 20 years, we've lost nearly 70% of our insects. And the famous story about this is, and it's true, when I used to drive my old Morris Minor around when I was a teenager, I'd come back on a summer evening and I'd have to wipe them off, the insects off the windscreen. And now you just don't. And I'm just reminding us that we can't grow food without insects, so we're back to utilitarian arguments, at least, about why this collapse of nature is going to matter. And we haven't talked about climate, and we're not going to very much, because sticking to my knitting, it's really nature I want to talk about, which I think has been underweighted in the discussion, because we're all aware, aren't we, of the climate situation. In Long Valley this morning, I was in shirt sleeves at the beginning of March. It did not used to be like that. I first started coming to this part of the world and Southeast Asia in 1970, and it's just a different situation now. But looking at what the world will be like across these lifespans, and I have grandchildren who will be absolutely alive in another 90 years from now. And the world they'll live in is extraordinarily different, even on the different scenarios. The wonderful Catherine Hayhoe, who's a great climate scientist, always does say, when looking at the predictions and what the modelling is showing us, unless we do something about it. This is not baked in stone. We have choices, we have decisions, there are things we can do. But on the various scenarios, it's still really extraordinary. And people are now anecdotally and personally talking about it. And this is why the term Anthropocene was bandied around. All of Earth's ecosystems are now influenced by humans. Nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history, and the rate of species extinctions is accelerating. The talk is of a sixth extinction. And there are numerous initiatives and international commitments to bend the curve of environmental degradation and put us on a sustainable path. So it's not as if this has gone without notice, and there's some major changes afoot, but they have to be much quicker and much more profound and much more systemic if we're going to bend this curve into what is called nature recovery. So this is for the artists in the room, and just to give us a bit of light relief, because I'm actually not a scientist myself, and data can seem a bit numbing, can't it? So I do love this. The English mathematician Charles Babbage wrote to the young poet Tennyson, "In your otherwise beautiful poem," he said, "one verse reads, 'Every moment dies a man, every moment one is born.' If this were true," he went on, "the population of the world would be at a standstill. In truth, the rate of birth is slightly in excess of that of death." I would suggest that the next edition of your poem should read, "Every moment dies a man, every moment 1 1/16 is born." Strictly speaking, said Babbage, the actual figure is so long I can't get it into a line, but I believe the figure 1 1/16 will be sufficiently accurate for poetry. So some of you here may not be wired for the data I've been showering around the room. And artists, of course, have not been immune to their visions of desolation in the future. So this is Hubert Robert envisaging the collapse of culture and the sort of destruction, I suppose, of the worlds as we know them. But you'll notice the young man in there, in the middle, still painting intently and furiously. It's a sort of sign of hope amongst the ruins. I have a book called Life in the Ruins, or whatever, it's something like that, just waiting to be read when I get back home. And many people's sense of our context now is we're living in the ruins, and this is being expressed in art and in music and in theatre, and it's gripping the imagination and the heart in a way that data can't do. Data isn't very transformative. We've been very fortunate in our own work, A Rocha, which means the rock in Portuguese, to have had a wonderful Taiwanese-American artist who's done a tremendous project with a poet about butterflies. And we're mobilizing musicians as well around the world, in our world of the church, to get music that does more justice to God's love for the world and not just for people in it, not just this me-centered music, my religious experience, my sense of God. But what does the good news mean for everything that's been made? So I'm just popping that in there for anybody who is feeling depressed by the data and feeling, anyway, data doesn't do it for me. So what I want to do at this point is to suggest, with some humility actually, that a really strong argument for why nature matters has always been with us. And the reason it's with humility, and maybe those who heard me yesterday will forgive me repeating this. If you imagine the situation that I described as a burning building, it's all going the wrong way. We have a major problem. 5 doors down from that building, sitting in a cafe, drinking coffee, and absolutely unmoved by the situation, are the people with the fire extinguisher. And they're really doing nothing about it. And the humility that I have here is that in many countries, the Christian church has been the last community or the last constituency to really care or do anything or be involved. And we could look at some of those reasons in discussion afterwards if you like. But that doesn't detract from the fact that there's an extraordinarily coherent view of why nature matters right at the heart of the Christian faith, even though many expressions of Christian faith in the West have been captured by a kind of anthropocentrism, what we call a genetically modified gospel, where the DNA of materialism and consumerism has so got into our understanding of what the good news is that it's a totally different thing altogether, like a spiritual accessory, like a kind of spiritual Gucci bag. I've got everything else, just I need a bit of peace, and I can find peace with God, and I'll just carry on and have peace with God as well. And I'm going to heaven anyway, so why does it matter what happens here on earth? You actually hear that quite a lot around the Christian world, and that's why I feel very humble and apologetic almost, trying to explain that there is a global change happening in the Christian community now, but it's late. And despite that, we're still figuring out what difference does this make in practice to Christians involved in finance and farming and fishing and in contact with the real economy. We don't really know, and we should know, because from the time the Industrial Revolution kicked off, there was a Christian church around, and if it had been thinking in the terms I'm going to lay out for you that the Bible thinks, we would never be in this situation. But here's just how one Christian, Chris Wright, expresses why Christians should care. We're to respond to an urgent global issue. We're to express our love and obedience towards God the Creator. We are to restore our proper priestly and kingly role in relation to the earth. In caring for creation, we embody the core biblical values of compassion and justice. All these points are built on the intrinsic value of creation to God. Now, there's the proper use of the word intrinsic, because it's an external reference to a loving God who, in Christian thinking, has called everything around us his fingerwork. That's what Psalm 8 says. Not even his handiwork. It's the image of a jeweler, of a designer. That's why it matters. And the self-standing mandate of God that we should care for it as he does. They do not depend on any utility or consequence of such action, such as human benefit or, God forbid, evangelistic fruitfulness. In other words, environmental things are trendy. Young people like them. My church has got no young people. I'll talk about environmental issues. Please. That's another form of utilitarian thinking that has no place in the church. We are to care for the earth because it belongs to God, and he told us to, and that's enough in itself. Very clean and simple, isn't it? So the problem is the lenses we bring to things. This is Simeon, who is the grandson of good friends of mine, and is very pleased when he appears in the talks, I gather. He has, as you can see, has Down syndrome, so when he goes shopping, the idea is to walk out of the shop with as much, he's a perfect consumer, walk out with as much stuff as possible. So when they took him to buy glasses, one pair of glasses is good, but this is a lot better. And I've just put it there to show how all of us bring our biography, bring the lenses we wear to what we read in the Christian texts about this stuff. And biography often will trump theology. It'll be more important. And I want to give you one very startling example of how those lenses I've talked about already, that we belong to the me generation, we belong to a world that assumes me and my life is absolutely the important thing, by showing you what happens with this passage of Scripture. This is from the first book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 9. It's the first time God is entering into an agreement. The only 4 words in there that are not Bible, but are put there by the translators from the Hebrew, are God's covenant with Noah. It's an agreement between God and the man in the story, because I'm the man in the story, so obviously I'm the most important thing. But you'll notice that 7 times, which is a very significant Bible number, it says very, very clearly that this is a covenant with every living creature on earth, a covenant between me and the earth. God is really starting to sound very New Agey here, isn't he? A direct relationship with the earth. Oh my dear, are we going to end up worshipping nature? But it's just very, very clear there. This is not God's covenant with Noah. There's an even worse version that our friend showed us yesterday, which says God's covenant with humankind through Noah. And it completely cuts out nature. And the Western Christian church has essentially done that. It's not surprising. If you are going through a time of great sadness in your life, when you read the Bible, you do tend to pivot towards the comforting passages. You just do. It's relevant to you. It speaks to you. It's fine to wear some lenses sometimes. But if it's at the expense of avoiding the plain meaning, which is that all creation matters to God, we're not reading the text for what's there. So what is there in the text? First of all, it is fundamental to being human that we are to be responsible for all of this. But notice it's in the image of God, so rule over does not mean a destructive rule, as has been suggested by Lynn White and others. It's in continuity with God's very own character as the creator. And the basic thing about being human is look after all of this. Didn't God take an extraordinary risk? And what's happened as a result? But he gave it into our care. And as has been said, I wonder what people would think we think about God from what we've done to the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. And in case we think it's just what serves us, that's the word livestock, behemoth in Hebrew. In other words, animals for us. Oh no, it's over all the creatures that move along the ground. We share a day of creation, incidentally, with all that creeps on the ground. We don't even have one of our own in the Genesis account. That's the first point. It's to be humanist to care. The second point is, we made it already. Chris Wright said it. It's not our earth. It's God's earth. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And we are, in a sense, dealing with the sacred when we're dealing with God's creation. We treat it according to coherence with the character of God himself. And this is this verse from Psalm 8 I mentioned earlier, that it is God's fingerwork. That implies relationship and care. It's a very unusual Hebrew word that just occurs a couple of times. It's very startling. But when we consider that, why are we even thinking about ourselves? That's putting us up in our place. Spend some time, if you can, just go out and look at the stars. It puts you in your place, and it resituates us from being the center of our own drama into being part of something more important. This is where it gets very interesting and a bit radical, because the Christian analysis of what's wrong with the world is we are. So you mentioned Al Gore earlier. At the end of the Inconvenient Truth project, Al Gore said, I have just been, and Al Gore was, by his own confession, not a particularly religious person. He said, I've just been puzzling over what's wrong, what's going wrong. And he said, for lack of a better word, I think we have a spiritual problem, is what he said. That it's a human problem. And this is a very specific account from 3,000 years before that is really identifying the fundamental broken link as the link between people and their creator. And it doesn't just have the social consequences we're very familiar with, cursing, lying, murder, stealing, adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. But the prophet, and many of the prophets do this, and they say there will be ecological consequences. Because of this, the land mourns, all who live in it waste away, the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the fish of the sea are dying. And this is 3,000 years before we thought there could possibly be a marine crisis. It's extraordinary. So what's wrong with the world is that we are in some sense broken spiritually. And so this is the puzzle. A friend of mine called Steve Garber in some writing has said, to press the point, why has evangelical theology allowed itself to be identified with a political vision that is so horribly ungreen, so unresponsive, and so irresponsible about our place in the world? And as he's an American, I will allow him to say that. But there are changes afoot. This is a book I'm very proud of. It's my daughter's 9th book. We are seeing a change globally in this kind of thinking, and evangelical theology is changing extraordinarily quickly. Why the cross is good news for all creation. This is Lent readings. It's just come out. Lent began today. I don't know if you were eating pancakes on Shrove Tuesday yesterday, or if that's a British thing, but anyway. Or I don't see anybody who's ashed themselves on Ash Wednesday either, but that's another nice traditional thing. In New York, a lot of bankers walking around with ash on their foreheads this morning, and I have my own thoughts about why that would be a good thing to be doing. But anyway, there are changes afoot in this thinking, and I would cite as evidence of this that in the country this book has come out in the UK, there are now 8,000 eco-churches of all denominations, churches that are trying to put into practice what the good news for all creation is. But there's still a huge amount to be done. We are drowning in plastic globally. My father was a plastics engineer, and I remember vividly, I think it was 1964, when I was, what would I have been then? 12. Him coming in and holding up a clear plastic cup and saying to me, this is going to be the future. They didn't know how to put colours in it at that stage. What my father didn't know was that every bit of plastic made since then is still with us. And in my case, it's in my cells and in your cells. It's omnipresent in our world. And we're seeing this across our own A Rocha network, across these 21 or whatever countries it is. This is just some of the places where the places we work are under threat from fire, from bauxite mining, from people shooting elephants because they're getting across their crops. You name it. We as a global network are now seeing far more pressure on nature than we've ever seen in the 40 years. And that's the way it's going. But And this is a huge but. This is the grounding of hope that Christians have, because actually it's not just us that have the possibilities for transformation because of that cross message, because of what it means that the life of Jesus was given for the life of the world, the cosmos, as the apostle, as John puts it. But the creation itself is going to be drawn up into the same liberation. We have to believe for that, and we have to start to practice it. And it's a final hope, but it's supposed to make a difference now, that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. We do believe, those of us who are Christians, that change, deep personal change, is possible. We have to believe it for the creation and not just for our own personal lives. And why this is going to matter is shown very evidently by these maps. Just look at the concentration of Christians around the world and the kind of percentages we're looking at here. High percentages of Christians in all of these countries. And why they're significant is because of this map, because they map over where biodiversity itself is concentrated on the planet's surface. So roughly 2% or slightly less of the planet's surface holds about 70 or 80% of the biodiversity. In Singapore, the tiny red dot, which there is a vision for making it a tiny green dot, incidentally, in the church, there is more biodiversity in Singapore than in the whole of the North American continent. And there is a high proportion of people living there who are Christians, most of whom go to churches who never talk about creation. So this is both a tremendous opportunity and a huge risk. If the Christian church either has dodgy theology, Jesus is going to come back, it's all going to burn, it doesn't matter, nowhere does the Bible say any of that, then the world has a problem. But if we start to understand as the Christian church that it's second nature for us to care for God's creation, the possibilities at a landscape scale are really tremendous. And this is the sort of history of how our own organization mobilized this, without going into the story because we don't have time, and I want to leave lots of time for questions and objections and the difficult stuff. But remarkably, we're still the only global organization that's doing this, and it's really odd to me when it should be core business for every church, for every community, for every organization. But just to show you in practical terms what this has meant in the landscape, in the foreground is where we lived at the beginning for 12 years, and where the A Rocha team, my Portuguese colleagues, have been for the following 30 years after that. What you see in the background is what's happened to the South Portuguese coast. Something like over 90% of it is now under concrete. The water levels have dropped so far that seawater is infiltrating up to 4 miles inland. Essentially, there's been a tremendous attrition on rare habitats and species and everything else. What you're looking at in the foreground is Christian good news written in the landscape. Those are still functioning vital habitats. The local community is still getting shellfish and fishing in the estuary. But it's really like that because Christians were there. It would not be like that otherwise. A journalist from O Público, the main broadsheet newspaper in Portugal, said, this is a miracle. And we said, yeah, it's a miracle. It's been a lot of hard work too. We have had to take to court a number of developers who've tried to go right the way around the laws, burnt the rare habitats to prove there was nothing there, but that didn't do it, and all other kinds of things. It's been a long haul thing. We're still in court. We're still stopping laws being breached. And then another before and after picture. When I first went to the Bekaa Valley of Lebanon in the 1990s, and on my first visit, an eagle was shot in front of my eyes and just crashed to the ground. People were shooting everything that went through that valley. It was just supposed to be Lebanon's last wetland, and it looked like that, and now it looks like this. And that's because Christians have been there for 20 years, pulling all the communities together. Wetlands in that part of the world are wonderful, but nobody ever really wanted them because they're full of malaria. So they're not anybody's territory. They're not Druze, they're not Shiite, they're not Sunni, they're not Christian. they're a great place to bring people from all communities to get together around this idea of how can we protect this incredibly valuable habitat. Essentially, all the migrant birds coming out of the eastern end of Europe and Russia and everything funnel down through the top end of the Rift Valley, which, as you can see, is a very narrow space, and then right down into Africa. It is an astonishing bottleneck. Up to 90% of some species go through there. And yet with the amount of armaments and everything in the place, it's extremely difficult. There are now hundreds of thousands of refugees in the valley as well, which is complicating things. But the long-term presence of the team means it looks like that. And just a few other quick stories. The Kenyan forest used to be 4,000 kilometers long from Somalia in the north down to Mozambique in the south on the coast there. It's down to about 40 kilometers only left. And people were chopping it down, we discovered, to pay school fees. So the trick was to turn the forest into the banker for the school fees. And everybody visiting the forest to see the elephants or the extremely rare birds there, that money goes to pay school fees, and it has done for 25 years. So there's something like 500 students have gone through school, some are university graduates and even working for A Rocha. But I sat with the Muslim community leaders there, because it's a predominantly Muslim area on the Kenyan coast, and they said, this has changed our community right the way through. And it's because of this faithful presence and putting into practice some of those Bible ideas I was laying out earlier. And you need them to be motivated to go through that. As an organization, we've been through considerable tragedy, and you don't keep putting one foot in front of another because you think it's going to help the economy. And neither do you do it for reasons you can't explain. You have to have very clear reasons. And I would also say you have to actually have the very life of God within you to kind of keep going at this sort of a task. We just built some infrastructure for tourists, and this is a boardwalk that gets to a bird hide. It's created jobs, it's generated income for the school fees, and now all the schools around the forest are planting trees instead of chopping it down, which was always going to be a one-way shot. And this is just some of the images from one of the fragments further north that we're trying to buy up, because there's very, very little left now, and it's critically important, and probably buying it is the only way we're going to do it. And working with the local schools and all the rest. This is just finishing now with an example of how one can envisage that we move from a philanthropic basis to funding all of this stuff to thinking about how could an investor make some money and leave the world better. And that is the challenge. Most of you are young people here. The challenge of your generation is to figure out a form of economy that is regenerative and not degenerative, because the degenerative era is coming to an end very shortly, and it'll be either a hard landing or a soft landing, but we cannot go on like this. So we have to figure out ways of creating wealth and finding human well-being for investors as well. This is one example. So what we've actually done until now, to provide clean water for people living near a wetland in Uganda, it cost about something like, I don't know, $25 to build a concrete box, fill it with sand, and it works as a biosand filter. You pour undrinkable water in the top and it comes out drinkable. And you just can keep raising $25 in multiples from generous people to do it. Or you can say to yourself that as each box gives 25 people clean water, they will save something over $1,500 on medical bills and on the charcoal that they're currently buying to boil the water. And by boiling the water in habitation which has poor ventilation, you get all of these respiratory diseases, which means you have to do the medicine. You're also going to save 33 trees a year, which is the amount of charcoal you're going to need in a year to keep your water boiled. And this adds up to kind of a business idea, that if for the cost of $45 you can get $1,500 of benefit, brighter people than me can figure out We should be able to help people make money and improve the water supply and look after the forest. It's just a simple illustration. But I just want to finish with the heart of why we've done all of this, to give you an insight of what a Christian conservation person is motivated by. It's not that we don't think there's human benefit in nature. We think the Lord provided it that way. We are thankful every day for the ways in which we're sustained. The air you have breathed out will very soon and graciously be being processed by the trees outside in a very short time. We are part of the community of creation, and it's a great gift of God. It's not that there is no human benefit. It's not that my friends who say nature just matters are wrong. It really does. They're onto something. But the reason we keep going and we keep doing this in all of those different countries and all of those different projects is fundamentally we're not doing it to save the world. The world has a savior. We don't even think we're probably going to change the world. I was listening to a New Zealand podcast that I'd done a few weeks ago, and the guy introducing it said, oh, and 1 million hectares of earth look different because Christians have been there. Well, 1 million hectares is a pinprick on the earth. We're not doing it to change the world. We're doing it because this is how to live as a human. And it's our act of worship to the God who made it all. And in gratitude and in faithfulness, that's the heart of the enterprise for us. So there we are, upcoming events. So if you're bored by that, you can just go to these instead.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was wonderful and clear and a very moving talk. Please have a seat here. I should do a shout out for our secretary, Candy, who has gone overboard with decorations. There's a frog here, as you can see. Just be careful of the water here, the tadpoles inside.
Yeah,
okay. Anyway, so
protein.
No. So thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I don't have time for now for questions. Always with Faith and Global Engagement, we have 3 rules, A, B, and C. A is please be articulate. So please formulate your questions very clearly in your head and then wait for a microphone so that we can hear your question clearly. So A, be articulate. B is be brief. Okay? This is not a time for you to make a long speech about the environment. Think of a question and make it short, sharp, and sweet. And C, be centered. Please center your question on what was said today in this lecture and not sort of ask some random question about, I don't know, Cambridge or Oxford or whatever, or your wonderful English accent. So A, B, and C, okay? Keep that in mind. So are there questions? Because I want to make this time sort of efficient so that we can get as many questions as possible. Please, hands up. So how many questions do we have here? I'm going to take about, we have a question there? Any more? And a question there. Let's have these 2 questions. Okay.
Hello. I want to ask, except for the amphibians being less able to attract fun, why do you choose tree frogs for the topic?
Yeah.
It's a tree frog question. Okay, and there's a question here too.
Okay, thank you so much for coming. I just want to ask, what are some practical or simple advice you would give for us to perhaps implement more environmentally protective policies in a local church, for example? And just a really quick side note, what's your favorite animal and why?
Okay, that's 3 questions. Good. So should we go? Let's start with the frogs. But it's kind of, they are in desperate trouble. And also my former boss, Simon Stewart, ran the global amphibian thing is a complete, I gather they're called herps. A herp is a herpetologist, so that you go herping. Where I go birding, they go out looking for frogs. And it's partly because they're not, one would think, particularly useful to us. They have this comic value. They are wonderful, and nobody seems to love them. And we don't think we have a relationship with them, but our choices actually do impact very, very much their future on Earth. The habitats they tend to live in are immensely threatened. Climate change is threatening them. Some of the species we've lost are because they've lived in very mist forest or cloud forest, which has dried out with climate change, and therefore they're subject to fungal diseases on their skin. they're just very vulnerable. And I wanted to choose something partly to illustrate that we have in our Western mindset the idea that faith is over here and the real world is over here and the two don't meet. And so for shock value, I just wanted to put faith and tree frogs in the same space and try to demonstrate to you why I think what people believe is immensely important. We will treat the world around us according to what we believe about it. When you look at architecture, when you look at a landscape now, you're looking at human ideas written in that stuff. It's not just neutral. I think now the film The Brutalist is out, people understand a little bit more the relationship between ideas and architecture than they perhaps did. But do you know, that was why I chose the frogs. To your two questions, A Rocha has a kind of a rule, which is we never tell people in a place what to do because I'm not from here. We have gathered as a global family around 5 commitments that we're Christians, that conservation is our core business, really committed to community and long-term relationships. We're very culturally diverse, which is why we kept this inconvenient Portuguese name. And we collaborate really widely with people of all beliefs and none if we're all about the same stuff. So how that translates in every place is really up to the place. And I know enough about Hong Kong from coming over the years to know you have very particular issues here, like the very high density of your living situation, but also tremendous nature, as it were, in real juxtaposition. The good news is, and I'm going to out him, Matthew, go and talk to Matthew, because he's one of the ones coordinating the Hong Kong Church's response to this situation. There's quite a big interest group now across different sectors of society in getting involved here. There are some great, projects. You could just help out with the Butterfly Reserve or the people who are surveying birds up at Long Valley where I was this morning. I mean, there's a lot of people to help out. You could do that. And your favorite bird, it's always difficult. I'm very immediate, So today, I did see some wonderful things. I've just spent some time pastoring a church in a town full of people interested in albatrosses, which was a really good gig. And so albatrosses are high up in my list, but probably my all-time favorite for sentimental and practical reasons would be the peregrine falcon, the fastest living being on Earth that can break 200 kilometers an hour in a vertical dive, and I've seen them do it. And I've also been fortunate enough to be where they're having bands put on them, and my photography has been able to read the ring numbers they fly past. And I love peregrine falcons. It was on a gasometer in London, and all the things they were eating were apparently the invasive parrots. There were lots of green feathers around the nest. But yeah, so peregrine falcon. But we could be here all night once we went down that road.
Other questions, please. So one question there, another question, and another question at the front there. So one here and one there. Yeah. There's another question, gentleman at the front, in the third row. Yeah.
Hello, Peter. Fantastic talk. Thank you so much. I have a question. It's going to be a hard one, I feel like. So conservation is fundamentally rooted or supported by science, but nowadays science, we're talking about secular science a lot of the times. We're trying to separate belief of faith with science. That's, well, at least that's what's happening in a lot of developed places in, all around the country, all around the earth. So how do you think we can bring science and belief together?
Can I do these one at a time?
Okay.
Right, in the modern setting, yeah.
I think that's a very good question, but I challenge your narrative. I think that was a long time ago that artificial breach was put in place. And we have a lot of scientists in our organization in A Rocha, working at a very high level. I've just been traveling with a network ecologist called Professor Darren Evans, who actually, if you want to listen, the A Rocha podcast is called the Field Notes podcast, and he specifically addresses both the question of science and faith, but also how in the academy it's perfectly reasonable to, as it were, surface belief. And the conservation movement is fundamentally shot through with belief. It's a missionary movement. It's trying to change the world around some ideas which are important. So I think the idea that you have a neutral space called science is quite redundant, actually. For example, again, looking at the money, you're going to get funded if what you are studying is reckoned to be important for your times. That's not a scientific decision. That's a value judgment. And so whole areas of the academy are directed by the values that the society thinks this is worth researching and that isn't. My father was a researcher, so I know a bit about this. And I know so many scientists who are quite open about their beliefs, whether they're Christians or not, actually. And if you're tracking it in the UK, there's a fascinating thing happening. There's a wonderful podcast called Re-Enchanting, and a book by Justin Brierley, who runs that, where many quite articulate and public atheists have been recently having major doubts and in some cases going to Christian belief. And I'll out him, although he's not here. So Professor Andy Gosler, who's a zoologist / anthropologist at Oxford University, was working alongside Richard Dawkins. And as an atheist Jew, that's Andy Gosler, he couldn't understand why Dawkins kept mentioning God at all, and in such emotionally dismissive terms. So he went out and bought some books about God and religious belief and found himself persuaded and has become a Christian and has God ordained. And there's a whole book called Finding Faith Through Dawkins, of some of whom I know, who are people who are not particularly thinking about God at all, but provoked by the kind of strident atheism into examining those arguments and then thinking, hang on a minute, there's no essential contradiction between science, which is one way of looking at the world, and belief, which is another. It's like saying you should smell a Stradivarius. I mean, you can do it, but it's the wrong thing to do to a Stradivarius. They're just different forms of apprehension, and it's a category error to go back to sort of Wittgensteinian, to try and put them in the same space. That it doesn't make any sense. So I don't see why there's any essential contradiction between scientific rigor and faith. But we could talk a bit more. It's a big, big question, you'll understand. And I recommend BioLogos as one of the projects. A friend called R. Louis, who is professor of physics at Oxford and a deep Christian believer, has talked about it and written about it quite a lot. There's plenty of articulate believing scientists and plenty of articulate atheist scientists, but I wouldn't have the faith to be an atheist, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, I just can't get there.
I think there's a difference between scientism, which is kind of belief in science, and also and scientists,
yeah.
Right? Because I think scientists cover a vast spectrum of people. There's another question. Yes, here. Yes.
Hello, good evening. I would like to ask, when you went to indigenous communities or local communities, did you ask them about whether, or communities who face like ecological degradation and they have seen it, have you asked them if they were interested in conservation or not of the habitat or environment?
Yeah, I mean, an African friend of mine says that the rural indigenous communities of the world have an unmediated relationship to their environment. It's their pharmacy, it's their food store, it's right there. It's not mediated through a supermarket or a petrol station or a pharmacy. Do you know, they live in that integral relationship with their environment. And so, absolutely, this is very much at the heart of the way they see the world. And it's completely threatening their well-being. I'll give you one example. I had the privilege of being in the Arctic just about 18 months ago. And I was able to talk quite deeply with some of the indigenous community leaders there, some of whom were Christian believers, some of whom weren't. And they were explaining to me just the practicalities of climate change. So this is a community that is a whaling community traditionally, and typically they had multi-year ice, which built up over a number of years and was therefore strong enough to haul the whale carcasses out onto the ice. Now the ice goes every summer. It's single-year ice. it's putting lives at risk. As you know, polar bears are now unable to get out to their seal prey. And their world has changed tremendously. And also without that ice barrier, when the increasing storms from climate change are much more violent, the whole community got flooded up there at Utqiagvik just 2 years ago. So I find they're far more in touch with what's going on than the urban groups that I speak with, who are living in an air-conditioned bubble. I mean, there are people who don't go out at all because it's now. In Texas, where we have friends, they had 100 days on the bounce of temperatures over 100 degrees. They treat their summer now like Brits treat their winter. You know, you go out reluctantly. So the old Texan barbecue and the steaks, to my disappointment, is no more. It's too hot. So, yeah, you'll hear it everywhere, and it's not difficult. I'll show you privately afterwards a couple of clips, if you like. But yeah, I think these voices are really important because people have become quite detached, really, from creation around them. And that's important from a belief point of view because in the biblical view of things, creation is telling us about God. And if you're totally surrounded by human artifacts every day, you can get a very, very false view of the world. One funny story from my own family to this, I have a niece who was shown for the first time a cow being milked by a machine, and she said, are they putting it in or are they taking it out? It's that level of, you know, we don't really know much about the world any longer, do we?
Other questions? There's a question there. Any more? Oh, you. Okay. We have a question there, and then we have the person that really has a microphone with a question. Yes.
Hi, Peter. Thank you very much for the sharing. Just so that I capture your thread of sharing tonight, it's conservationist, your organization, powerful work, and then you connect it to faith, and somewhat your call to action, or tangentially, it's investment related. So it draws to me kind of this distinction between philanthropy efforts, fundraising in that respect, and also, you know, investing in nature and, you know, changing. So how do you see the two? Just I was really, took me by surprise positively that, you know, that was sort of the conclusion that you got to, if I may. Pardon my negligence if I missed anything.
No, that's very perceptive, and I confess it was a slightly context driven conclusion that I chose tonight, because I just know that this is a city where there's intense interest in that, and some creativity, I may say, in looking at impact investing and other different forms. But if you look at how traditionally conservation has been funded, the two big ones, apart from individual donors and foundations, were zoos, which obviously had a tremendous interest in conserving the species that they were then showing to lots of people and raising that awareness. So there were zoos and ecotourism, which is how a community can maybe get some income from the nature around it. Both of them fell over in COVID. They stopped dead. And either way, a friend of mine, Simon Stewart, who was running the Species Survival Commission, has said, conservation works, but we just need to do 100 times more of it, but probably only 100 times more of it. And the budget would be less than the soft drinks budget of the USA. So we're not talking a lot of money. And I can give you two great ideas for $1 billion straight off. And I did have a friend who had 17 billion, and she was a friend. One is, and Enrique Sala, the National Geographic's explorer in residence, although he says that's an odd title. If you're an explorer, how come you're in residence? But anyway, Enrique Sala has said, just take the non-territorial waters out of fishing. It's only 4% of the global catch. It's highly subsidized, and it will allow the coastal fisheries to recover. Just do that. That'll cost $1 billion. And then the other thing for $1 billion is stop logging. Just keep the forests we've got. They're at about 20% of capacity now. Just let them recover. That will pull something like 25% of the carbon out of the atmosphere in the next 40, 50 years. And it'll only cost $1 billion. So there are some basic good ideas out there, and I leave it to my bright business friends who seem to be able to figure out how to make money out of, I mean, they can make money out of nothing really. They just invent something and sell it to people. It seems to me, a lot of the time. Anyway, whatever. But now I've offended everybody. I'm getting D-mob happy. It's the end of this trip. But essentially, if you look at a lot of the financial products, I mean, I can hear my father, who was an engineer, rolling in his grave at the thought that it's an industry. It doesn't make anything. You have, I'm going to risk it. What you have is a bunch of capital here and the real economy down here. And imagine it connected by a series of pipes like this going like that. And at every bend of the pipe, there's a lawyer or an accountant or a risk person just taking 1% off all the way down. The trickle between the capital and the actual real economy, there's about 5% left at the end. It's like film financing. If you want to finance, be a filmmaker and get financed. You get this great chunk of money. By the time it hits the director and the filmmaker, there's basically nothing left. And all of that industry is part of the key to how we change this. Because imagine if it was reinforcing the flow, if it was amplifying the impact of capital to do good things in the world, what the power of that would be. And I have this, again, I said it last night, so forgive me those who were there. I persuaded at least somebody in a church in the USA once that this was core business for Christians. And he said, okay, I get it. I have 3 daughters. What would your career advice be to them if they really want to do this good stuff? And I said, become bankers. Because policy is great, legislation is great, education is great. We've done it all. It hasn't really made any difference. What we haven't done is re-imagineered the economy to bless the earth instead of devastating it. And there are technical reasons why that's happening. So even if it hadn't been Hong Kong, I would have said it. And actually, we in A Rocha are trying to imagine some businesses around the world to bless communities and their places. And we're kind of just at the very beginning and realizing how difficult it is. But simply because we're here and everybody agrees we're here, everybody agrees we've got to get to there, and therefore there will be a journey. And so, okay, it's little steps and we'll make mistakes and we'll lose some money and we'll end up wrecking a place instead of healing it. And, everything will go wrong, but we've got to be on the journey. Nobody disputes that. And it's not for a clergyman from Birmingham in the UK to tell you what to do about it, but I'm hoping there might be some bright people here who'll give it a go.
Steve, you have a question.
Yeah, I just had a question. I was struck by the story you were talking about where by saving the forest you could pay for the children's fees, their schooling fees. And but if 85% of the world kind of identifies with one religion or faith, to what extent are the faiths working together in these issues? Are the conservationists, you mentioned the Muslim family or community that was quite appreciative, but to what extent are the conservationists within each of the faiths working together? Is that happening?
Yes, it is happening, but I'm torn about this because we have a place at the table in some international fora because we're a faith-based organization. And you'll get a major event like the World Conservation Congress and they go, oh, A Rocha's faith, they can convene the faith groups because they're all basically the same. Those are the faith guys, and we're the rational, scientific, people who don't have any faith. We don't do that stuff. And that division, I just think, is nonsense. It's just that people don't name their religions, but they've got them if you push them. So I think it's not that we're in the faith space and other people aren't. Having said that, and secularism, incidentally, is a faith. I lived in France with laïcité for 14 years. I know what a belief system that is. So having said that, for us in A Rocha, we'll work with anybody of all faiths and none because there's loads of common ground, particularly in environmental issues, because this affects everybody. So we do have wonderful partnerships with different faith groups. I gather that I think it's in Ghana, our eco-church people have been working with the eco-mosque people, and there are great resources in many of the world's religions. There's an organization called the Alliance of Religions and Conservation that's explored this, but both for Christians and for others. And this happened a bit when we were working with the Vatican over the Pope's fantastic declaration, Laudato Si. We've been good on declarations, we've been good on conferences, we've been good on paper, and books and what G.K. Chesterton called poor, talkative little Christianity. But what's the difference? And I think the Christian faith is meant to work and not just be an adornment. And I think there are faith-inspired practical initiatives around the world, and they're beautiful things. But that's what we've got to lean into, is them making a difference in their communities and in their... But we will work with anybody who wants to. And we've mobilized some faith concepts in the Middle East, for example, around land to find common ground with people of many different beliefs and to be a convener. And in Lebanon, for example, you have to have your belief on your identity card. You're a something. So a Western secular conservationist who turns up and says, I don't believe in anything, they're going, what? You know, you don't believe in anything? I don't believe you. You believe in money or something, whatever.
Any burning questions? Good, because I have one. And maybe this will be the last question.
I'm hungry.
No, I have one. And last question, but maybe it can be also the big takeaway for everyone here. So I get it that the utility argument doesn't work and the intrinsic argument doesn't work, and then I can understand also that the argument from faith, based on belief in God and His creation, is something that drives what you're doing, and that there are many Christians in the parts of the world that where there is great biodiversity, so we need to protect that part of the world. So those Christians need to really get their theology right, and so on. But my question is, what if you are not a Christian? Let's say you don't have that worldview. What are you putting forward that would help motivate all of us really to take part in caring about nature? In other words, can the argument be made without necessarily a very strong advocacy for God, as it were?
Yeah, I think it can, because I think both the intrinsic argument and I hope you haven't heard me say that they've got no merit. Mm-hmm. I think they have got merit. And if I'm with my friends who are not believers, but like me are a grandfather, I just say, you've got grandchildren, right? So I feel I'm living in the days of slavery sometimes, that people have got their money where nobody should have their money. If you've got grandchildren, why would you be cooking the planet with it? And you're treating ESG as a box-ticking exercise rather than actually saying, what is my business doing for my grandparents' world? And you saw that graph, so I think those are perfectly valid arguments. You don't have to be a believer. The destruction of potential medicines, that there's plenty of good arguments. You don't have to be a person of faith. I just think that if you press those arguments to their logical conclusion, they start to get a bit shaky. Particularly if you're trying to translate them into conservation practice and choose your priorities and do it. But those arguments have merit. Mm-hmm. And at the beginning of Romans, the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul said, the world, paraphrasing, the world itself tells us enough about God that we should know. Just the world. You don't have to have been given a Bible, met a Christian, any of this stuff. Just go out at night and it's talking to you about God, and in some sense. So I think all of these arguments have got merit. I just think that if we're going to be ruthlessly logical, you will end up, I would argue, in a place that looks awfully like the Christian faith. Mm. But as to why the Christian faith is valid, that's a whole other evening that somebody might do, but not me.
But it would be wonderful if you, as you had said, that if those with faith really take up the call.
Yeah, and that's the
key thing, right?
That's why I'm
with
embarrassed.
The inspiration.
Yeah,
yes.
That's why I'm embarrassed. Mm. But there are wonderful, if you push them. So I'm not going to name him, but I was with a National Geographic Photographer of the Year last week in Singapore, fantastic man. And he was just basically saying how it's his Christian faith that guides the way he takes photographs of nature, that enabled him to stand up to his chest in water in crocodile-infested rivers in order to get this unbelievable image of an orangutan playing hide and seek with him behind a tree. And his faith and his photography come together. That's going to be another episode on the Field Notes podcast, by the way, so you can. But I think that it's just much more powerful when you've got that compelling reason for what you do, and it gets translated into all those other disciplines.
And in a way, when you begin to care for nature, it probably would bring you closer
for sure.
to God in that sense.
Well, that has been, we've heard that 1,000 times with the students and researchers who've stayed with us completely. I mean, when you have been, like me, a bird ringer, you know you catch a bird 4 winters running in the same bush, and meanwhile it goes off 3,000 miles to the north and comes back again. You just kind of think, oh, really? Is this an accident? You know.
Well, Peter Harris, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing the wonderful stories and wonderful talk. Thank you very much. Thank you.